In this episode, we're setting up animations and sound effects when falling. So the first one, when coming to an abrupt stop. Next, when plummeting from a very high height. And last but not least, when we're not facing the direction in which we're moving, skidding to a stop. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode, and today we're setting up our animations and sound effects for our player falling on the ground. With this episode, we're not actually yet setting up damage to be done to our character, but that's going to be next episode. Usually I cover the dynamics of something first and then go into the effects, but it kind of made sense to reverse it this time. We're going to take care of how a fall is actually going to act in the world, and then we can set up the complete infrastructure for damage and health. So in this episode, we basically accommodate 3 different situations for falling. If the player is running very, very fast, so they have the speed boost active, but they land and they're still moving in that direction, then they're just going to go right into a run animation and no harm, no foul. But if they have that speed boost active and they're not currently holding forward, like they're not currently moving forward when they hit the ground moving at a very fast velocity, that's when it's going to go into that roll animation. And I'm anticipating with that roll animation, it's like you hit the ground and your feet aren't going as fast as the top of you and you roll. It's still doing a little bit of damage, but not that much. But then there's the last situation, and it's really 2 different situations. So you're plummeting from a very high height and you're going straight down, you hit the ground hard. Yeah, you're just going to land really hard. But then I thought about also the situation where the player's velocity is like this, but they're facing to the side, they're facing a different direction. And in that situation, I think to minimize damage, a character would typically kind of fall down on the ground, so we can use the same animation for the hard landing. And then last but not least, of course, we need sound effects for all these landing animations, and for that, we're building off of all the footstep sound effects that we set up in episode 19. So here are all the assets that we're using this episode, so I'm assuming that you've already checked out episode 25 for getting Mixamo animations into Unreal Engine 5 and mapped to the UE5 mannequin, and if not, feel free to check it out. We cover the entire process in about 6 minutes. And all the sounds that you're going to hear this episode, they're all from episode 19, and you could check in the description below, there's a link to the spreadsheet of all the sounds and assets that we use for free during this series. So here are the key concepts for this episode. We do have a couple of new things here. So we have transition rules that are anim state transitions to move from one animation to another, and it uses something called an automatic rule, which just assesses, okay, as soon as this animation is complete, automatically transition to the next state. And then when we're actually in a fall animation and the player shouldn't be able to do anything, they shouldn't be able to cast spells or walk or run, we're actually going to disable the controller input. In the last one, we're using for our sound effect to basically get the sliding sound that you heard on the intro. So let's get to it. Alright, so we're going to start today by going directly into our animation blueprint. So mine's under my core folder and our third person character ABP. And we're going to start by going under our anim graph here and actually going to our main state machine. And if you're unfamiliar with state machines, I recommend checking out episode 27. The first 20 minutes or so, I go into a deep dive on how to create a brand new state machine. And that's when we create this spellcasting standing still state machine. But what we're going to do, we're going to set up 2 different animation sequences instead of landing. Now, if the player just lands normally, this is exactly what's going to happen. But the 2 others that we're going to set up, one is for landing straight down, and one is for landing with forward motion such that the player is going to have to roll. So I'm going to come down a bit underneath landing, and I'm going to right click, and we are going to add a state. This is going to be hard landing roll. And then I'm going to add a second state. So right underneath it, right click and add state. And this one's going to be hard landing straight down. And I'm going to make a little bit more room here. So basically from to land, the player could either go straight to land, which would be a normal landing, or it could be connected up to hard landing roll, or be connected up to hard landing straight down. And now from land, if the player lands normally, they can go right into spell casting. But with these 2, I don't want to have that happen. I want them to go back to locomotion first. So there's a little bit of a delay in spell casting if they do a hard landing. Same with this one. So now before we set up the rules that are connecting all these things, let's first go into each of the states and we'll just hook up our animation sequences. So for our hard landing roll, I'll just go to content drawer, back to content, over to characters, mannequins, animations, Manny, Mixamo. And I set these up ahead of the episode. If you're unfamiliar with how to take Mixamo animations and translate them into the Unreal Engine 5 mannequin, I do it in about 6 minutes in episode 25. So for our hard landing roll, I'm going to use the stand to roll animation here. So I'll drag that in and I'll connect this up just like that. And then we'll go back to main states. We'll go to hard landing straight down. And we'll do the same exact thing. So I'll get our hard landing for UE4 retargeted, and that's our straight down, and connect it up. And back to main states. So let's just quickly set up these 2 rules here, because if we consult this land to locomotion rule here, you'll see that it's an automatic rule based on sequence. So basically the sequence ends and then it transitions over to locomotion. And I think I want to do the same thing with both of these. The other thing you'll notice is that the duration is 0.4 seconds. So let's just do that. So I'll select this one. It's going to be 0.4 seconds. It's going to be an automatic rule based on sequence. And I'll go on to the next one. We'll do the same exact thing. Duration 0.4, automatic rule. Compile and save. Now it says to land to hard landing roll will never be taken because we haven't set up these rules yet. So we need to figure out the criteria by which the state machine then knows, okay, in this situation, I'm going to go into a hard landing roll. And in another situation, I'm going to do a hard landing straight down animation. So to figure that out, we're going to start by going into our third person character. So mine's back to content, core, our BP third person character. So let's first talk about when the player character is going to go into a roll. And I see that happening in the situation where the player's velocity is still moving in that direction and they're still facing forward, but the player isn't actually telling the character in that situation to go forward. So if you think about it from a running standpoint, if I'm running very fast and then I jump up, but then when I come down from the jump, if my legs don't immediately start moving, then what's going to happen? The top part of my body is just going to go right into a roll, or I'll face plant right into the ground. Obviously, we don't want to face plant, so I'm going to do a roll instead. So the situation where I'm going to make that happen is when the player has no forward input, but the velocity of the player is in that direction. So the first thing we need to do is we need to ascertain, okay, do we currently have forward input? So am I pressing W on the keyboard? And so for that, I'm just going to create a brand new variable here in our third person character. So I'll do a plus sign, and we're just going to call it forward input, question mark. And that's going to be a Boolean. And for that, I'm going to categorize it under movement. So then I'm going to go back to our event graph. And on our event graph, we have our input axis move forward, backward right here. So the way this works is if I'm currently pressing forward, this axis value is going to be 1. And if I'm not pressing forward, then it's going to be 0. So all we're going to do is we're going to get this value. So I'll just say, does this value equal? And I'll make this a 1. And then we'll branch from that. Connect this up. And if this does equal 1, then we could set our forward input to true. And if it doesn't equal 1, then it's going to be false. It's that simple. So I'll duplicate this, and the top one's going to be true, and the bottom one's going to be false. And then I'll just make a comment for this stuff. So the comment is going to be assesses forward input for purposes of hitting the ground at high speeds. So let's compile and save. And now we have to set up some stuff on the animation blueprint for determining, okay, is our character moving fast enough such that they need to go into a roll when this is set to false. So if I go to ABP third person character, and we're going to go back to our event graph. So over here on the left, event graph. And I have a whole bunch of things that we've set up in previous episodes for happening on event tick. And so I'm just going to sort all this a little bit, clean it up a little bit. So I can get rid of this pin right here. 4 is going to be over there. And this is actually going to continue to grow a little bit. Hopefully we're getting close to a final state, so we're not doing so much on event tick. But the way we're ultimately going to determine whether or not our player is going to take any sort of fall damage is through the force that's exerted at any given moment in time vertically. And when I say force, it's really a change in velocity. And the way I like to think about this is in terms of a concussion. So if you're familiar at all with concussions, what's actually hurting your brain is the brain hitting the side of your skull. So it's your brain moving at one speed and the rest of your skull is stopped. And so the impact isn't so much on your brain directly, but it's your brain hitting whatever is stopping it. And the same goes for fall damage. So you could be moving at 1,000 miles per hour, and if you gradually come to a slow stop, you're going to be fine. But if you go from 1,000 miles per hour down to nothing in like a single instant, a single tick, that's when you're going to have fall damage. Well, in that case, you'll be a splat, but you get the idea. So what we're going to do here is we're going to assess every single tick. Okay, did the player's velocity change enough such that they should take damage? And this is also going to apply for collision damage in general, like if the player's running and slams into something, but we're going to get to that in 2 episodes. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to set up a new variable. So I'll hit plus sign here, and this variable is going to be vertical impact force. And the reason I'm going to make a separate variable for vertical impact versus horizontal impact is your body's designed to actually hit the ground. The legs, that's what they're specifically designed for. Less so if you hit the same velocity sideways, your body's not really designed for that. So a sideways impact with the same force, it's going to do more damage. And this is going to be not a Boolean, but we're going to change it to a float. And we also need a second variable, so I'm going to hit plus sign here, and this is going to be called previous velocity. And the way I'm going to get that change in velocity is by looking at our current velocity and our previous velocity and measuring that difference. So the previous velocity, we're going to set that to a vector. And so for both of these, I'm going to go to vertical impact force to start, but we're going to categorize them under essential movement data. And all my other variables are in the one with a space. I'm not sure why there are 2 there, but so be it. So previous velocity, we're going to switch that to essential movement data. And then in the sequence here, we're going to add a pin. And here's where we're going to get our vertical impact force. So we are going to set our vertical impact force, and that's going to be the 5th thing we do here. And this is something we're checking every single tick because the player is moving in real time. And what we're going to do is we're going to get our velocity variable, and we are going to compare that. So we're going to minus our previous velocity variable. So previous velocity, get that, connect this up. And I'm just going to turn off the debug object for now, just so that we're not getting that annoying hover. Okay, so from this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the struct pin. We're just going to get the Z value, and that's going to be hooked up to the vertical impact force. And then we're going to get our current velocity, and at the end of this chain, then we're going to set our previous velocity. So set previous velocity. And then for the next tick, we're going to have our current velocity updated because that gets set in the number 3 here. And then by number 5, it can compare our current velocity to the previous velocity. And then we have our vertical impact force every single tick. And then we can assess every single tick. Okay, does this exceed some threshold? Because if your foot's just hitting the ground or you jump normally and you hit the ground, it's not going to exceed a threshold where it's actually doing damage. So where do we actually specify that threshold to determine, okay, if this threshold is exceeded, then we're going to do damage. So in the next episode, we're going to tie that in with our player's health and figure out how that's going to actually affect gameplay, like affect how our player plays. But in this episode, we're just worried about the animations and the effects of that immediate impact. So that means we can go back to our main states and we're going to use those variables to determine, based on these rules, which of these animation paths we're taking. So let's first start with the default rule. So I'm going to go into this not is falling rule. And we're going to keep this logic, but we're just going to expand it a little bit. So the player has to be not is falling, and there's another criteria. And so for the other set of criteria, what I'm going to do first is get a reference to our third person character. And we're going to get the forward input variable that we just talked about. And the other thing we want to do is we want to get the vertical impact force, and we want to check to see, okay, is this less than 1500? And I came up with this number just through experimentation, what seemed reasonable based on experience. So if the vertical impact force is less than 1500, or the player is currently moving forward, so they're deliberately moving forward, if either one of those is true, then as long as the player is no longer falling, they're going to be able to enter into this standard to land animation. So connect all these up just like this, compile and save. And let's go back to main states. And the land animation, just to show you that, that's the one out of the box. It's just the standard one. So it's a sequence player, and it's just boop, 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 and it goes right into locomotion from there. So back to main states. So before we go into the rule for hard landing roll, let's just go back into this rule. I'm just going to copy all of this stuff, and we're going to use that as the starting point for this one. So I'll go into this one, paste it in. I'm going to delete out this or here, and I'm going to move over the forward input just a little bit. And this is going to have to be not. So not this, not equal, but come up here and do a not Boolean. So basically this is saying if the player has forward input, we're not doing a forward roll. But if the player does not have forward input, and there's another criteria we need to assess, if the player's ground speed is over a certain threshold, and the threshold that I found to work well is about 1000. And that just means that they're moving very fast when they hit the ground. If both of those things are true and is falling is not true, that's when we want to get into the ground roll. So I'm going to add a pin here. I'm going to connect up here. I'm going to connect up here, and then connect this up to the result. Let's go back to main states. And once again, I'll go to land. I'm going to copy all this stuff again back to main states. We're going to do the last rule here. So this is the straight down rule. So I'll paste all that in. So for this, we don't need the forward input or this. And instead, what we need is the ground speed. And if that is less than, I'm just going to set the threshold here to be 501. Because this animation, at least to start, I'm going to use it for straight down. We're going to talk about a situation where I'm going to change this, but just to start, let's set it up this way. And the reason I set this to 501 is because the standard run speed for the player is 500. But now for this hard landing animation, we want it to play if the vertical impact force is greater than or equal to, and the threshold I'm going to set is 1500. So now if those three things are true, the player is no longer falling, the ground speed is not all that fast, but the vertical impact force is very high, the player's jumping from a high place, then this is going to be true. Connect this up. So now compile and save, and it successfully compiles, and we are ready to begin testing this. So I'll pick up our air ability here, activate it, and running very fast, and then, so the player goes into the roll. Now I can launch straight up, and let's see how he falls. Yep, falls hard, he goes right into the pavement. But I do notice upon landing that there's some issues here with the foot IK. The other issue I notice is if he's facing the wrong direction, then he rolls in the wrong direction. So how about we lock the roll so that the roll can only occur if the player's actually facing in the direction of the velocity, and I talked about that earlier. And then if they're not facing in that direction, then we could actually do the hard landing straight down. So the player's feet would actually kind of scrape across the surface as they're moving in that direction that they're not facing. So let's go back and do our animation blueprint in the event graph, because what we have to do is we have to determine right here when this vertical impact force occurs, is our player currently facing in the direction of their velocity? So what I can do is I can get a reference to our character and come down here, get character. And then from the character, I'm going to get our mesh. And from the mesh, I'm going to get our world rotation. So what direction is our mesh currently rotated in? And then what I can do is I can get our previous velocity here. And we got to figure out the rotation of that previous velocity. But one thing I found is I just got to make that into a negative number. And the reason I got to make it negative is because the velocity is going to be in the opposite direction of the rotation. And by multiplying all that by -1, then we get a negative vector. And then from that, I can make a rotator from z, because all I care about is what direction the rotation's occurring from this axis. And then I can break our get world rotation here. I'm going to split this, and I'm also going to split this as well. And what we're going to do is take the z-axis for both. We're going to subtract both of those, connect this up to here, connect this up to there. And we don't really care if the rotation is to the left negative or to the right positive. We just care that the rotation is relatively close to whatever direction the previous velocity was. So because of that, I'm going to take the absolute value of that rotation. And then I'm going to check, is this less than 30 degrees? Because if it's more than 30 degrees, then the player really isn't facing in the direction that they're currently moving in. And then we can branch off of this. So we're going to branch, and I'll connect this up. Actually, I'm going to take our previous velocity and velocity node. I'm going to move that out past beyond this. So I'm going to take all this. I can move it all over here, branch right over here, connect this up. And so now we need another variable. So we're going to come down under variables, plus sign. This is going to be facing direction of velocity, question mark. And that's going to be a Boolean. And I'm also going to put that under essential movement data. Okay, we get our facing direction of velocity. We're going to set that. And if this is true, meaning it's less than 30 degrees, then this is going to be true as well. And if it's false, meaning this difference is more than 30 degrees, then it's going to be false. And then after we set that, then we can set our previous velocity right here. So now we have to set up our transition rules within the main state machine to basically take this variable into consideration. So let's go to main states. And for this one, the to land, we don't need to touch that one. That's exactly the same. But for the hard landing roll, let's go into that. And all of these need to be true still, but now we have a fourth criteria, and the fourth criteria is facing direction of velocity. And compile and save, and then back to main states and our final rule here. So this one, we've got to restructure quite a bit. So I have to disconnect the is falling not and put it here. And then I'm going to connect this to the end here, this to the second pin here. I'm going to disconnect the third pin. We're going to remove that, move these both up, move all these out. And this is going to be a straight down hard fall. So this is straight down hard fall. But then there's a second set of criteria by which I want this same animation to be used. And that's when the player is not facing in the direction that they're actually moving. And they still need to be moving pretty quickly for this to occur. So the first thing is we'll get a reference to our ground speed again. And for this one, it's going to be if it's greater than or equal to 501. Then we can get a reference to our facing direction of velocity variable, and we got to make sure that this is not true, because if it is true, they're just going to go into a roll. And last but not least, we can get a reference to our third person character, get, and for this, we have to get our forward input. And if the forward input is not being pressed, that means our player is not moving forward, and then they're going to go into this animation. So if all these things are true, and I'll add another pin, connect this up, connect this up. So if this or, and we'll connect up this, and I'm going to add a comment for these, and that comment's going to be, see how fast I can type here. Here we go. Moving fast, X, Y, fall, where player facing direction is not aligned to the velocity. And I just said X, Y here because that means horizontally the player is moving quickly. So let's put is falling and not over here. Let's connect up these to an and, so that and the player's not falling. I know this is complicated, guys, hence the comments. Compile and save, and let's test it again. So now, if I'm not facing in the direction, yep, I just go right into a hard landing. But if I am facing in the direction, right into a roll. But one thing we need to fix now is if we do go into a hard landing, the player can just move right away. So we really want to stop all input when the player goes into a hard landing. So that includes movement, but it also includes things like gameplay abilities. So let's set that up. So the way we're going to set this up is with 3 different anim notifies. And to start, let's go back over to main states, and let's go back into our hard landing roll state here. And I'm going to go directly into the stand to roll for UE4 animation. So I'm just going to pause this. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to create 3 new anim notifies here, but we're not going to trigger them here. So I'm just going to delete them out after I create them here, because what's going to trigger them is actually hitting the animation. And that's going to be done if we go back to our animation blueprint, back to main states. It's going to be done directly in the rules themselves, the start transition rules, where we transition from one state to another state. So back to stand to roll. So let's right click on here, add notify, create a new notify. And this is going to be hard landing roll. And I'll go ahead and delete that one and then right click again, add notify, new notify. This is going to be hard landing straight down. One word. Delete this one out. And the last anim notify we're going to need is not actually when we start the animation, but coming out of the animation, basically a recovery event. So for that, I'm going to right click, add notify, new notify, and this is going to be hard landing recovery. And we'll also delete that out here. So back to our animation blueprint, if I select our second rule here, so this is where we're going to define our first event. So this is going to be hard landing roll. And then for our third transition rule here, this is where we're going to have the second event we created, hard landing straight down. And when I say event anim notify, it's really the same thing. It's just being triggered off of an animation or an animation state change in this case. And you'll see why I'm setting up two different transition events here. But one reason is the hard landing roll, it's not going to do nearly as much damage to the player as the hard landing straight down. And the reason is from a physics standpoint, if you're going into a roll from a fall, it's not going to do as much damage to you because the energy is being transferred. It's not going directly into your legs, into your body. And so the last thing we need to set is what event's going to happen when we come out of these. And that's going to be our recovery event. So for this one, I'll select that rule and then start transition. That's when we're going to do our hard landing recovery. And actually, that's going to be hard landing recovery. Make sure you get these verbatim. Exact spelling is important here and no spaces. So then you copy it and we go to the second rule and we're going to do the same recovery event for this. So now that we've got our anim notify events and we've got them set to trigger when these transitions occur, now we can actually tell these events what we want to have happen when they trigger. So for that, we go to our event graph and I'm just going to come down, come down, come down. I'm going to make some space directly above activate main ability effect. So I'm just going to move these down. And we ended up not using our anim notify jump land right. So I'm going to keep that there for now, but we're not currently using it. And that's from, I think, episode 19 or 20, the footstep episode. So anyway, so underneath that, we're going to do a anim notify hard landing to start. So hard landing, and we'll start with our roll. And then directly underneath that, we'll do anim notify hard landing, and we'll do straight down. And so now the question is, how do we actually disable the player's input when we go into that hard landing? And it's actually really easy. So we need a reference to our third person character. So mine is stored under references, third person character. I can drag that in, get, and I can drag out a pin and I could say disable input right here, disable input. Connect this up here. We're just going to duplicate that and connect it up just like this. Connect up our execution pin just like that. So now we need to enable input when we actually come out of the fall animation. So for that, we're going to do an anim notify again, and this is going to be our recovery one. So anim notify recovery, hard landing recovery. And we can get a reference to our third person character again, and from that, I'm going to enable input. And what these are doing is they're basically disabling and enabling any sort of input from our player. So nothing from my mouse will work, keyboard won't work, none of it. But if you think about it realistically, if you just took a big punch or a big fall, you're not going to be doing anything else other than gasping for breath, probably. So compile and save, and we are ready to test. So the first thing I'm going to test is let's try to skid and see if we can move while skidding. Nope, can't move until he gets back up. And now let's try a hard roll. And then as soon as he rolls, we can get back up. But during the roll, we can't move at all. But we still have a problem here with foot IK. Let me just show you this. So if I'm running and then I turn in the other direction, so you see our feet are kind of floating above the rock there. So let's set up our foot IK in our control rig to work with this animation. So if I navigate over to our anim graph, and this is the control rig that I'm talking about here. And back in episode 37, our first issue fix episode, we adjusted this slightly so that if the player's spellcasting standing still, it still works in the control rig. But now we need to do the same thing if the player has a hard landing, but they're not rolling. And so for that, we need a new variable. So I'll do +, and this is going to be hard landing no roll. And it's going to be a Boolean. And I'll just move this also under essential movement data, the one with spaces. Collapse that, and we'll go back to our event graph because over here, this is where we'll go under our essential movement data. I'm going to get our hard landing no roll, and we're going to set this, and we're going to set this to be true if we're doing a hard landing straight down animation. Set it to be true, and then coming out of the animation here, that's where we're going to set it back to false. So we're going to set this to false, and then this is going to drive the control rig. So back in our anim graph, instead of just spellcasting standing still, we'll get our hard landing no roll as well, and then if either of these is true, I'll do an or Boolean, connect these up, and then connect this up here. And in case you didn't check out episode 37, let me just show you what that's doing. So the spellcasting standing still variable in the control rig, it's still doing a forward solve if that's true. But all it's doing is at the end of this string of events, it's assessing whether or not that's true, and then it's subtracting from our Z offset L target and Z offset R target, basically 5 centimeters. So it's lowering the feet down just to ensure that the feet are actually touching whatever surface they're above. The one last thing I'm going to do here before I leave the control rig, I'm just going to change the name of this. So back in our event graph, if I go back to the event graph, so these two things are driving that variable, but what this variable is actually doing in the control rig is adjusting our player's feet. And so I'm just going to change the name of this. I'm going to right click, I'm going to rename, and I'm going to rename it to adjust feet when standing still, because that's really what's happening. I guess the player's not actually standing still if they're sliding across the ground, but close enough. All right, let's compile and save this. Back in our animation blueprint, we get an error here. So all I need to do is I need to discontinue this pin. It's just because I changed this variable name. And then I need to select the pin over here again. Then it shows up. Then I can reconnect. Everything's good. Compile and save. Voila. All right, now we get to see how our feet do on uneven ground when they're sliding across. So let's take a look. So I'm running pretty fast, jumping. Yeah, the feet look a lot better there. So the last thing I want to work on here is really the sound effect for when our feet are grinding across the pavement or across rock or across wood, really across anything. And initially when I was thinking about this, I was like, okay, let's go over to Zapsplat, let's look for sounds, let's try to find grinding sounds, we could play those. And then I had this kind of crazy idea. And I didn't think it would work, but it actually worked pretty good. So you could look for your own grinding sounds, but I'm going to show you what I ended up doing for that if our player's still moving along a surface and their feet aren't actually moving. Because we're basically going to leverage all the sounds that we set up back in episode 19 for our footstep effects, but we're just going to play them very quickly so that they sound like a grinding sound. So it's really easy to set up if you already have footstep sounds. So let me show you how to do that. So we're going to go back to our animation blueprint and we're going to create a brand new function. For that, I'm going to go back to the event graph, and under functions here, I'll just hit +, and I'll call it sliding footstep sound. And in this function, we're first going to assess, is there forward input? Because if there's forward input, then the player's not sliding across the ground. So we can get a reference to our third person character, get, and we can get our forward input variable. And then from that, we're going to branch, connect this up here. And the next thing we need to assess is our player's velocity greater than 0? Because if it's greater than 0, we want to play a sound. And so for that, I can get our velocity under essential movement data, get, and then from that, I can get the vector length, and that's going to tell us the overall velocity length. And if that is greater than 0, then we can do another branch. In this branch, this is going to be connected up to the forward input false, so the player does not currently have any forward input. So then here's what we're going to do, and this is really simple if you did episode 19 already. So back in our event graph, let me just show you this. So in episode 19, I've got to come up a little bit. We set up our anim notify left foot plant and right foot plant. And I'm literally just going to call those same exact events in our sliding footstep function. So I'm going to come over here to the true, and the true is going to be anim notify R foot plant. And then we're going to do the same thing with the left, anim notify left foot plant. So now you heard me say we're going to play this sound really, really quickly. And the question is, how quickly? And the answer to that is every single tick. And so to do that, we can just set a timer for next tick by function name. And the function name is going to be our sliding footstep sound. So sliding footstep sound. So basically this function is going to be called every single tick unless this is true, unless forward input is true, or if this is false, meaning our velocity drops to 0. But then what do we want to have happen if this is true or this is false? So in that case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clear timer by function name. And that's going to be the same function name. I can just copy and paste that. And that's going to ensure that this function never endlessly repeats. And connect it up here too. So if you've got all these pieces, then you're looking good, and we can compile and save. And the last thing we need to do is back on our event graph, we need to go back to the functions that we created this episode, because we need to actually call that function the very first time that a sliding sound should start. And this is why we created two separate anim notifies here, because this top one, for the roll, we don't want a sliding sound. It's really only for the straight down one, where the animation has the player's feet kind of locked into position. If they're moving in that case, then we want a sliding sound. So right from this pin, I'm just going to do sliding footstep sound, call that function, and that's going to set off the chain of events. So let's compile and save. And one other thing I want to mention, I did this just to make the sounds sound a little bit better. I did this for all of our footstep sounds that we did in episode 19. And that's under content, under sound, if I go under character, human, footsteps. And this takes a little bit of time, but basically I went into every single type of footstep for running and walking. So let's go into run here, into the cues. And what I did is I added a modulator to every single sound cue. I just made the pitch minimum and maximum between 0.9 and 1.1 just to vary up the pitch a little bit, and the same with the volume, 0.8 to 1.2. And that just ended up varying up the grinding sound, but it also varied up the footsteps generally, and I felt that that was just a better overall effect. So let's test this out. So the first thing is, let's test this out on gravel. So 4 and... yeah, so I really like that gravel sound. Then I gotta run over to our wooden bridges to get a good test of wood. Alright, so you ready? Yeah, so it's a little bit quieter, but I like that sound as well. Really, the only surface I don't like the sound is on stone. Let me just show you. Yeah, it just sounds kind of artificial with the footsteps going into the stone. So if you have ideas on how to do that on stone a little bit better, I'm all ears. Let's also set up sound effects for our roll animation as well. And for that, I just determine on the animation itself, like what is each point on the animation where a body part is hitting the ground. So that could be the shoulder, it could be the head. It's just a quick series of anim notify triggers. So back in our animation blueprint, I'm just going to go right back to our main states here and into our hard landing roll state and into the stand to roll animation. Pause it here. So we just got to figure out where we want each of those sounds to play. And I always make those sounds trigger just a little bit ahead of where the thing is actually going to hit the ground. So the first thing is going to be his right hand is going to hit the ground. So we could do add and notify. And for each of these, instead of creating separate anim notifies for each body part, I don't think we need it. We don't need that level of specificity. So I'm just going to go to skeleton notifies and we're going to do a right foot plant. We're just going to pretend his hand's actually a foot. And these anim notifies we set up back in episode 19 with the footstep effects. And then right after that, we're going to do a left hand plant, left foot plant, add notify, skeleton notify, left foot plant. Make that a little bit closer here. And then he hits with his elbow. It looks like it's his left elbow. I'm going to move it over a little bit so that's slightly raised. And we are going to do the same thing. So right click, add notify, skeleton notifies. And that's going to be the left foot plant. Move that over here. And then he's going into his head. Ooh, that's going to hurt a little bit. And then right click, add notify, skeleton notify. His head is more to the right side of the body, so I'm going to choose right foot plant there. And then his shoulder, or I guess his back is hitting, so that's going to be his left side of the body. So that's going to be add notify, skeleton notify, left foot plant. And then after his back rolls a little bit, his butt hits right about there. Is it his right butt or his left butt? My daughter would love that joke. It's on the left-hand side of his body, so I'm going to say his left foot. And then finally, his right leg comes down, but it's actually on the left side of the body. So again, we're going to do an add notify, skeleton notify, left foot plant. And then finally, his left foot comes down. Actually, before that, his knee comes down right about there. So that's going to be on the right side of the body. Skeleton notify, right foot plant. Move that over. And last but not least, finally, his left foot comes down right about there. So we're going to do add notify, skeleton notify. That's going to be on the left foot plant. Doesn't have to be exactly like that, but that's a good series of hits where it's going to make some sounds in a rolling fashion. So let's try that out. Let's save, and we are ready to test. All right, moment of truth. Yeah, it's just a little ch-ch, and he's up. Let's try it on the wood. Can barely hear it because of the river sound, but it's enough. It sounds decent. So next, just like our stand to roll animation, I'd like to add anim notifies also to our hard landing animation so that we increase the sound when landing. Because if we go into that, there's really a couple different sounds that need to occur. So our feet hit, but then also the hands hit. So what I'd like to do is that the feet should trigger a jump landing sound from episode 19, but then the hands should have kind of a lighter footstep sound. And so for the foot anim notifies, we're actually going to take care of that elsewhere in our event graph. But for the hand notifies, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to right click, we're going to do add notify, skeleton notify, and we're just going to do our right foot and our left foot. And even though it's really the hands, they're kind of similarly placed to where the feet would be if the player was just landing normally. So I think it's going to work just fine. So I'll do our right and left, and we'll do those right next to each other. So we'll right click, add another notify, skeleton notify, left foot plant. I'll move them up just a little bit because we want the sound to actually start playing just before the hands actually hit. So we'll save that, and then for our feet, here's what we're going to do. So back in our animation blueprint, right after this sliding footstep sound for our anim notify hard landing straight down, that's when we're going to do our foot jump landing effect. And I didn't really intend to do this, but this is perfect. So back in episode 19, we ended up setting up our anim notify jump land left and right foot. And the right one we ended up disconnecting because it just created an extra sound effect that didn't sound good. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all that, and I'm just going to drag it right down here, and we're going to trigger it right here. And if you want to know exactly what this is doing, feel free to check out episode 19. So compile and save, and we'll test that out with jump landing. So now I'm up pretty high, release. Yeah, pretty decent sound. Now for the grunting sound effects, we'll get to that next episode. The very last issue fix we've got is in our anim graph, and it's related to the control rig that we set up a few episodes back in episode 38. And we set up this control rig basically to rotate our head and neck, but also our upper body in whatever direction the camera is facing. And basically, if the player is falling hard or if they're sliding into that fall, then they're not going to be rotating anything. Realistically, the player is going to be distracted dealing with that fall. So to address that, I'm just going to add a third criteria here, a plus sign to the and I'll drag out a pin. And from this is going to be a not. I have to go all the way up to the top, this not boolean here. And under our variables, under essential movement data, I'll come down, get our hard landing, no roll. We just got to make sure that the player is not in a hard landing. Compile and save. So the next issue we're going to solve is the fact that the player's head and neck can go right through a rock when they're sliding. And for this, I have a really simple and unsophisticated fix. So we have to go back into our animation blueprint, the event graph. And if we come back down here to our hard landing straight down anim notify. So what I'm going to do is make some space here, move this over just a little bit, and we're going to get a reference to our third person character. And from the third person character, we can get a reference to our capsule component. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the radius of the capsule component when we go into that sliding animation. So we can set capsule radius, and I'll make a little bit more space here. So this capsule radius here, I'm going to set it to 90. And the way I got this value is back in our third person character. So I went on the capsule component in the viewport, and you could see our capsule half height and radius here. So the radius can't be higher than the half height, but you can increase this to 90, which is virtually a circle. And so back in our animation blueprint, we'll set that to 90, connect this up here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste that below. We'll set it right back to the normal 35 right here. And this is when we go into the recovery. Also, one last optimization to this. I noticed that sometimes the player character could just slide off a rock when they're in the falling position because the capsule is still larger when that happens. And the part of the capsule is still on the rock, and the player kind of sits there in midair until the fall is done. And so for that, I have a very simple fix for that too. So under the anim graph, we're going to go into our main states. We're going to go into our hard landing straight down into the hard landing animation. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to set a position probably somewhere right around here, add a notify. We'll do a new notify, and we'll just call this reset capsule. And exactly when it hits there, that's when it'll reset the capsule back to that 35 radius. And the reason we could do it much earlier in the animation is because our player's velocity is going to drop precipitously from here to there. So by the time they get here, their velocity is going to be close to 0 anyway. So we'll save that. We'll go back into our animation blueprint, back over to our event graph, come back to where we just were. And right underneath it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a reset capsule anim notify. And then from that, I can just call this exact thing. So I'll just paste this down here and connect this up. So let's test this out, compile and save. So I'll test this on the exact same spot. All right, here we go. Yeah, so our player's head and neck can no longer go through. The very last issue I'd like to take a crack at solving this episode, so we're not going to solve it entirely, but at least partially, is our hand IK. So when our player actually lands on the ground, can we adjust the hands to be even with whatever rock face, whatever surface they're touching? And I did some playing around with this, and I got pretty close to an ideal circumstance. It's at that B+ level, so let's do it. So for this, we got to go back to content, we got to go to characters, we got to go to mannequins into our rigs folder. Because what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate the control rig for mannequin basic foot IK here, and we're going to set it up the same exact way, but just set it up for our hands instead of our feet. So I'm going to right click here, I'm going to duplicate, and it's going to be CR mannequin instead of basic foot IK, basic hand IK. And by the way, if you don't have any prior experience with Control Rig, I recommend checking out episode 38. I do a very quick tutorial on how to integrate Control Rig with the anim graph. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So I'm going to go into our mannequin basic hand IK. And if you've been following along with this series, you probably have a few modifications to the standard one like I do here. Like this, you're not going to have if you haven't been following along with the series, but that's totally fine. You could follow along right here. So what we have to do here is we basically have to go line by line and update the bones that we want this to update. So I'm going to start on the first line here. And instead of doing our IK foot L, this is going to do our IK hand L. Come over here, same thing here, IK hand R. This is our right hand. And then over here on the right, so I set this up when standing still, basically casting spells while standing still. And we're going to keep this. We're actually going to do this where we set an offset downward. but we're not going to do it based on a Boolean here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this out, and I'm going to connect it straight up to here. And the reason we still need an offset is because in general, characters' arms are going to be shorter than the character's legs. So we need that offset to be about 20 units, 20 centimeters lower than it would have been otherwise. So I'm going to change both of these to 20. And then I'm just going to change the comment up here. So the comment is going to be subtract 20 from the Z offset L and R because arms are shorter than legs. All right, so now we got to come down to the second row. And actually the second row, we're not changing anything here, so that's all good. The third row, once again, we got to change our bones. So this is going to be IK hand L. Over here, this is going to be IK hand R. And then the last one, instead of the pelvis here, we only want to blend this above the waist. So we're going to change this from pelvis to spine 0, 1. So that's the first bone right above the pelvis, upper body. And we'll come down to our last row, final row here. So step 5. So instead of IK foot L, it's going to be IK hand L. Same thing here, IK hand R. And then over here on the right, we got to keep pelvis here because we're still doing full body IK, but this is going to be hand L. So we're mapping IK hand L to the actual hand. And then we're doing IK hand R to actual hand R. Hand R. So a few other things, mostly aesthetic. We can delete out our adjust feet when standing still variable. You're only going to have that if you've been following along with this series. If not, you don't even need it. And then I'm just going to go through and adjust the comments here. So our first comment, then do traces on both hands. We already adjusted our comment over here on the right, so I can come down to the next. The comments here are totally fine. Well, except for step 3, let's do lowest hand. And instead of pelvis, we'll make this spine 0, 1. And then step 4, we'll change this to hand bones and spine 0, 1, or I'll just say spine. And then finally, step 5, use the IK hand bones as the effector targets for each hand. Compile and save this. So our last step, we got to hook this up in our actual anim graph. So for that, we'll go back to our animation blueprint, and we'll go over to our anim graph. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make some space between our first control rig and the second one that we set up in episode 38. And then what I can do is I can just copy our first control rig, paste that in. We just got to switch out our control rig class here. So this is going to be basic hand IK. And now we just have our one variable. That looks good. Hook this up just like that. Hook this one up to this control rig. And the last thing is we need a variable to determine should we do the IK trace. The variable we're going to use for that is under essential movement data, our hard landing no roll. So we'll select that, connect it up, and compile save, and we are ready to test this out. All right, so the way we test this out is we're just going to slide hard across stone. And we want to see what our hands and upper body do. So we saw it adjust there and just test it out on a variety of circumstances. Like I said, it's not perfect. You know, there are still situations, like right there I noticed where it was off. There are still situations where it's not going to work perfectly. But if you have ideas, if you have better ideas for this, please let me know, because I'd very much like to adjust our hand IK to make it even better. So that concludes today's episode, and in the next episode we're going to deal with all of our damage and health mechanics. You probably noticed that heartbeat sound in the background. In our player's idle animation right now, it's a little bit off, and it's because, well, I fell from a high height and he's damaged. But you notice the heartbeat starting to slow, so we're going to set up that mechanic, and then also setting up the mechanic to basically have a limping animation when walking, well, running in this case. So I hope to see you there.